Hello and welcome to our 28th Virtual Research Cafe 10.0. I'm Frank Gomez, Executive Director here at the Chancellor's Office at STEMnet. Behind the scenes, we have Monica Alacon and Jesus Perez of STEMnet. Much thanks to both of them for working out the logistics and publicizing today's events. The goal of the cafe is to help foster research collaborations across the CSU and catalyze submission of proposals from CSU faculty. The cafe brings together assistant professors from the CSU campuses to share their work in a relaxed setting for 10 minutes, the reason we call it the 10.0. We hope you'll find opportunities for collaboration on or learn about a new area of research that may impact your own program. Feel free to contact any presenter in the chat box when they're not presenting. At the end of the 3 presentations, we'll all come together for a Q&A. I'll be monitoring the chat box to call questions from the audience. So let's begin. Once again, we have 3 speakers presenting a snapshot of their work. Our first speaker is Dr. Jenny Hazlehurst from CSU East Bay from the Department of Biology. Jenny, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Can everyone see this okay? Give me a thumbs up icon. Okay, great. Yeah, I'll go ahead again and get started. So today I'm going to be presenting about how we can conserve pollination services in a global biodiversity hotspot. And just a spoiler, the hotspot is California. This is a great place to work. Okay, so we are currently undergoing a global biodiversity crisis. Recent extinction rates, the rates at which we're losing species, are about 1,000 times higher than they would be naturally. And the causes for this include the various aspects of global change. So this is things like habitat loss, climate change, and various pollutants. And this is affecting pretty much every type of living organism on the planet. Now, there are ripple effects of biodiversity loss because species don't occur in a vacuum. They're often involved in mutualistic interactions with one another, whereby one species really can't survive without the presence of another. So pictured here is a pollination interaction network showing animals that are pollinators on the left and plants that they pollinate on the right. And a line in between them indicates that that pollinator visits that plant. So what would happen in this ecosystem if we were to lose one of our pollinator species? Well, that would likely have cascading ripple effects on other species in the network that could eventually lead to the loss of additional species. And many of you have probably been aware that bees are, in fact, part of the biodiversity crisis. You've probably heard the term save the bees. And the poster child for save the bees is actually the European honeybee, which ironically is not an endangered species and was actually introduced to North America from Europe to pollinate our crops. It is very important for our food, but it's not a biodiversity issue per se here in North America. However, we do have over 4,000 species of native bees that are native to North America, and several of these are in fact endangered. In addition to insect pollinators, we also have a lot of important vertebrate pollinators, so things with a backbone. This includes things like hummingbirds and even bats. Hummingbirds are especially important in the Americas. They actually don't occur anywhere else in the world. So as I mentioned earlier, California is a global biodiversity hotspot. It's also known as the California Floristic Province. We have over 160 endangered plant species, which are endemic, meaning that they aren't found anywhere else in the world. Despite its importance as a global biodiversity hotspot, little is actually known about pollination in the CFP. So one thing that some of my students are doing is conducting a comprehensive literature review of the known pollinators of these native plants, especially the endangered ones. And so far we've discovered we know very little. About 57% of federally endangered plants that we've surveyed so far have no known pollinator species. So the goals of my lab broadly are to study how global change affects pollinators and pollination in California's unique ecosystems and how we can then restore pollination to these habitats that have been impacted by global change. So I'm going to share with you just a little snapshot of one to two of our projects. So this first project I'm going to share looks at how deforestation in an iconic California ecosystem, the redwood forest, affects native bee biodiversity and those pollination networks that I showed you. Redwood forests are, of course, endemic to California and Oregon, and they include some of the tallest trees of the world in the world. However, about 95% of these forests were actually clear-cut by the mid-20th century for timber harvest. So this means that in addition to a few remnant patches of old growth redwood forests that have never been harvested, we have various types of what's known as secondary growth forest, which is forest that is growing back from being clear cut. Some of these forests are now about 100 years old, but they have a very different structure than old growth forests. They tend to be very dense and crowded with trees that are all small and of the same size. In addition to these forests, we also have some that are actively managed through processes like restoration thinning or selective logging, whereby small groups of trees are kind of removed here and there to try to replicate the structure of an old growth forest. So we were interested in seeing how bee biodiversity and network complexity would compare between these types of forests. And we thought that old growth forests would probably have higher bee biodiversity and higher complexity than naturally regenerating secondary growth forests. So I went with crews of CSU East Bay undergrads. We camped in the woods in Santa Cruz. Some students had not been camping before. It was a great experience for everyone. And we actually discovered 14 native bee species in redwood forests. The ones pictured here, we could not identify to the species level. So it's actually possible they could be new to science. We found, as predicted, that the old growth forest did have higher bee biodiversity. However, those actively managed forests actually had much lower biodiversity than either other type of forest. So that was surprising. So something I want to talk about here, which is kind of an interesting, broader aspect of my research, is we use network analysis tools to actually identify restoration priorities in these habitats. So I introduced you to pollination networks earlier. Here's one that we constructed from the old growth forest in the redwoods. And we can actually identify species that contribute to the overall stability of this network and potentially prioritize those species for conservation efforts to sort of buffer this ecosystem against the loss of certain species. So some of the metrics that we use include degree centrality, which refers to how many of the possible connections within the network a species realizes. Betweenness centrality, which is, you know, how many paths between other species does this species lie along? And closeness centrality, which is the inverse distance to all other species within the network. And by distance, I mean, for example, this right here, this is a bee species, and it's actually indirectly connected to this bee species via this plant that they share. So that would be a distance of 1-2 interactions away. So we did this with our redwood data, and we were able to identify some potentially important species. We did find surprisingly few high centrality species in old growth forest. That network had surprisingly low complexity, perhaps as a result of its overall small size, because there aren't very many old growth forest patches remaining, and they tend to be in very small clusters. But we were able to identify some bees and plants that we could then try to conserve to improve stability of the system as a whole. And the ways that we can do that is by identifying things that those pollinators need or things that those plants need. So for example, for bee species that are potentially important to the whole system, you can identify their nesting resources and potentially supplement those. And so unlike honeybees, which have big hives and live socially, most of our native bees are actually solitary. And they can nest in places like holes in the ground that they dig, little burrows, or really beautifully, they can also nest in the cavities of stems or even in little holes in rocks. And they actually line their nests with little pieces of flower petals and leaves. It's really gorgeous. And so we can experiment with augmenting these resources in these habitats to contribute to the overall stability of the network. We can also use network analysis directly for endangered plant conservation. So I worked with the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden to go out to San Clemente Island in the California Channel Islands. It's an active military base, a challenging place to work, but there are several really cool endangered plants there. We constructed networks for those plants and were able to identify potentially important high centrality pollinator species that could then directly support those endangered plants. So overall, the way that that works is we go to a place, we construct an interaction network for plants and pollinators. We then are able to identify priority species that either directly support plants or pollinators of interest, say endangered species, or we can identify high centrality species and try to provide them with the resources they need to succeed in order to achieve overall conservation goals. One other project I want to mention is looking at how pollinators adapt to the urban environment. So this is, again, another kind of aspect of global change that my lab researches. And we do this by looking at hummingbirds. So some hummingbird species are able to thrive in urban areas while others do not. And I'm sure several of you have probably seen hummingbirds in your yard. So my lab is interested in looking at how hummingbird diet varies in rural and urban areas for one of these species that really thrives in cities. And this is the Anna's hummingbird. And shown here is a figure actually based on some research that came out of CSU LA from the Wood Lab, showing that Anna's hummingbirds have actually expanded into areas with high housing density over the years. So these species really love cities. And so it's possible that this ability that they have to live in cities might be due to some more plasticity in their diet. So by comparing rural and urban areas, we can learn more about this. I'm also interested in seeing how those potential changes in diet might affect their gut microbiome, because that could also have implications for hummingbird health. So we thought that Anna's hummingbirds would forage on a more diverse array of plants in urban areas due to the availability of ornamental plants. And that they would show more seasonal variation in their diet, especially insects. A lot of people don't realize hummingbirds eat insects as well in more rural areas. And as a result of these diet variations, we're expecting to see some distinct gut microbiomes in rural versus urban areas in these hummingbirds. And here you can see a student releasing a hummingbird. So our field methods, we set up these traps to capture hummingbirds along this rural to urban gradient in the East Bay of Northern California. We capture the birds using baited traps. We put a little ID band on them. We collect a fecal sample, and then we release the bird. The fecal sample is then taken to the lab. We extract DNA from it, and we're able to amplify certain regions of the DNA in that sample, right? Because the DNA in the sample could come from anything that the bird ate, including any bacteria in its gut too. And we can identify gene regions that can be used as barcodes. Think of when you're at the grocery store and you scan an item and its identity pops up on the screen. We can use these barcode regions to then do next generation sequencing, sequence them, compare them to a database of known sequences, and understand that what their diet items are and what their gut microbiome might be. Oops. And so stay tuned for that. We're still processing those samples, but the study could potentially allow us to better understand potential threats to hummingbird health. It could inform landscaping choices in urban areas, and it may indicate ways that we can augment resources for hummingbirds in more rural areas. And with that, I would like to thank my fantastic students and collaborators, my funding sources and partners, and I will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Jenny. We'll have a Q&A towards the end of all the presentations. So thank you.
Sorry
Very
about that.
interesting. No problem. No problem. So our next speaker is Jorge Botana Alcalde from Poly Pomona. Jorge, he's in the Department of Physics. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So let me share my presentation. Here we go. All right. So today I want to talk about research on DFT, and because I consider that if what the audience may be more interested on is more than the specific things I've done, which I will comment on, is exactly how I do it, because that's what opens the certain paths there for collaboration. So first, let me say something about myself. My name is Jorge Alcalde, and although right now I'm working here close to LA, in Pomona, Poly Pomona, I come from Spain. I come from a little corner northwest of Spain, in the city of Santiago de Compostela, city with a lot of history, but it's a small city, like 100,000 people, mostly students. All right. So let's start talking about what I do. So what I do is theoretical solid-state physics. And what is theoretical solid-state physics? Well, solid-state physics itself is the study of properties of materials in solid phase. And what do we mean by materials in solid phase? So materials that are crystalline, crystals, but not only these kind of crystals, also metallic crystals. Also alloys. Alloys are kind of like crystalline materials, but they have randomly atoms of a different type inserted in their structure. So there is a certain element of randomness. And there is amorphous materials where the structure is the positions of the atoms respect to each other is completely random. But how do we do that theoretically? Because of course, if we are doing this experimentally, you just take the material, you do things to the material in order to find out what properties they have. But how do we do this theoretically? So there are two main ways. One is either we create a model that gives us the behavior of the material, whether it's mechanical behavior or electric behavior, or we can run simulations. And modelization and simulation could seem the same, but a model has nothing to do, not explicitly, with the internal structure of the material. In the simulation, we are actually trying to calculate starting from the properties of the material itself. There are two types of simulations. One is semi-empirical, so we take some data from the experimental measurements, and that informs the calculation. Or we can do ab initio calculations, ab initio simulations. That's what I do. What do I mean by an ab initio simulation? An ab initio simulation is a calculation from first principles. So we're going to the fundamental equations that tell you how matter behaves. And if we're talking about the properties of a solid, like the properties of all matter, at the end of the day, the properties at the macroscopic scale of all matter depend on where the electrons are and how the electrons interact with each other. The electrons of one atom, how do they interact with the electrons of another atom? That's going to give you all the properties of a solid material. And how do we calculate that interaction between electrons? We have to solve the Schrödinger equation, quantum mechanics. And that's easier said than done. The Schrödinger equation has a lot of terms. It's a wave equation. So we start to already don't have like point mechanics. We have a term of potential energy that if we're studying electrons, the potential energy depends on the interaction of the electrons with the nuclei, the interaction of the electrons with each other, and then other interactions that are not even classical, that are not Coulombian. So, and then those are n equations that are dependent of each other. So that's really an absolute mess to solve. If we have a system with more than a few electrons, with more than 2 electrons, that's really, really difficult to solve, even for supercomputers. So we have to find alternate ways. And that is what DFT is, density functional theory. Density functional theory is a faster way to solve it. Instead of solving the Schrödinger equation, which includes this wave called the wave function, we're solving for a density of electrons. And it's been proven that just knowing the density of electrons gives you all that you need. So why should we use DFT to calculate the properties of materials, of solid state materials? So let's go through the things that we can find with DFT. And this list contains periodic systems, crystals, and alloys, kind of. And also systems that are not strictly solid state, because I have worked also with systems that are not strictly solid state, like nanoclusters and molecules. And so what can we find? Of course, the electron density, that's the goal of DFT, finding the density function that gives you the distribution of the electrons, the electron structure. With the electron structure, you can obtain all the properties that the material has. So we can obtain the material's geometric structure. In case that is not really known, we can always do an exploration using DFT on what is exactly the lattice parameters of a certain crystal, the atom distances, the angles, all the parameters of the geometric structure of a certain material, the atomic structure. We can find what electrons are taking part in bonding. Sometimes we need to know when we have 2 atoms interacting with each other, they're bonding, what is the character of those electrons. We can calculate reaction enthalpies. We can calculate the enthalpies of each one of the reactants, and then we calculate the enthalpies of the product, and we have the reaction enthalpy. we can calculate transport properties. Starting from the electron density, we can figure out what character each electron has, and then we see that certain electrons are going to, certain states are going to appear available to the electrons, and those facilitate transport properties. Superconductivity, that is so, that is being in the regular newspapers all these past few days with this room temperature superconductor. Mechanical properties, the Young modulus, the formation, etc. That kind of mechanical answer can be calculated since we can obtain the stress tensor for a material. And the things that we can't do, more or less, because some of them can kind of be done, but is. So we can't work at finite temperatures. DFT is formally DFT is calculated at 0 temperature. But then how do you calculate materials at normal temperature? There are two things to be said. First, the difference of a material between temperature 0 and temperature, say room temperature, is not that big. And there are workarounds. If we consider that the heat, that the temperature is just lattice vibrations, you can add those vibrations ad hoc in a post process, and you can find how the properties you calculated at T0 can change at higher temperature. We cannot study time evolution, but then again, there's also workarounds about that. There is such a thing as time-dependent DFT, which is a slight modification in order to allow for a time evolution and see how the reaction happens in real time, well, simulated time. And also what we can do is study large non-periodic systems. Large non-periodic systems, that's right out. If we're talking about systems that have more than thousands of atoms and they're non-periodic, that's outside of what can be done with DFT. And what have I done? What have I done? So let's go through some highlights of my past research to see if any of that interests any of the audience. So I have worked with DFT as subjecting matter to extreme conditions. I have studied, one of those conditions is low dimensionality, either systems that are very, very, very small or that they have a restricted number of dimensions. For example, I have studied chemistry and the magnetism of atomic nanoclusters. I have studied what is the correct shape of atomic nanoclusters of several constitutions, gold, lithium nitride, etc., and see if for example, gold clusters being magnetic. And I also studied how their magnetism and how that structure changes when we're trying to make them interact. We're trying to make them react with other atoms, in this case, adding oxygen molecule, extremely, extremely electronegative. And I have also studied the magnetism of ultra-thin film layers, like stacking iron, chromium, iron multilayers, only a few atoms thick, and seeing how the magnetism changes as we increase the thickness. I have, more recently, I began to study the chemistry, which is chemistry shorthand for how the electrons interact with each other at ultra-high pressures. So I have found in my research, I have found that many elements that don't seem that are known to have well-defined oxidation states. For example, say the mercury here in this picture, mercury that is well known to have an oxidation number 2. We can make it. We can induce through the use of high pressure. We can induce it to have oxidation states 3 and even 4. It is the mercury 4 crystal, which is a crystal made of basically this kind of diamond molecules with mercury at the center and then 4 fluorines. So it's a kind of like a molecular crystal in a way. And that there's a strongly ionic mercury fluorine 3. And talking about ionic materials, at high pressure, we have found that some ionic materials have something that we call ISQs, interstitial quasi-atoms. What is an ISQ? What is that thing? So if you have an ionic material, like all crystals, those materials, those crystals are going to have interstitial spaces. Sometimes under high pressure, those interstitial spaces are not going to be completely empty. Sometimes electrons, completely isolated from atoms, completely isolated from nuclei, they decide to exist in some of the interstitial spaces as some sort of quasi-atom. This is why it's important that it's an ionic crystal. It has to be an ionic crystal because then an isolated electron acts like one more ion of the crystalline lattice in the interstitial spaces. And while one could say, okay, but are you sure that that's really why do you dare to call it quasi-atom? Maybe it's just a state that belongs or is that shared between some of the atoms around it. That's not the case. First, because we would be saying that then we have not an ionic crystal, it's a covalent crystal, which is not the case once we study the electronic structure. But we have seen that sometimes those ISQs, those interstitial quasi-atoms, those electron states separate from nuclei, they actually form bonds with each other. It's really fascinating. And recently, what I'm doing right now, what I'm working right now is in the chemistry of Earth's inner core. So what am I trying to find out about the Earth's inner core? So in the Earth's inner core, what we're trying to do is solve the density problem. We know that, let's see, in this figure, we have this red line, which is the density versus pressure curve for an alloy of pure iron with nickel, which is the composition of the Earth's inner core. We know that the Earth's inner core is solid and is made 90% iron, 10% nickel. And that alloy, the curve of density versus pressure is this red one. But on the other hand, through our measurements of the Earth's properties, we know that the density versus pressure of the Earth follows this gray line. And this pressure, this vertical line, indicates the transition from the outer core, which is liquid, to the inner core. And we say that in the inner core, which is the one supposed to be made of only nickel and iron, there is a 3.6% difference between pure nickel and iron pure nickel and iron and the core and the Earth's inner. So I have combined iron with several light elements and with several heavy elements in order to see how that changes the density of the Earth and the other mechanical properties of the Earth that can be verified using seismic waves.
Jorge, can you finish up your presentation soon?
Yes.
Very soon. I'll give you 1 minute, okay? Thank you.
Sorry. So collaboration opportunities. So what are the interdisciplinary strengths of the DFT? Is basically the idea. Let's simulate that first. In engineering and chemistry, if something is difficult or expensive to synthesize, but you think it could be interesting, we can simulate it before having to synthesize it and spend all that money. Or if you have a material with interesting properties, we can explore and research the whole family of materials. In chemistry and biology, if you have a certain interesting chemistry that you have modeled or you have observed, but you don't know how quite works at the fundamental scale, at the atomic scale, we can actually observe and visualize it. And related to computer science and computer information technology, if you do machine learning or artificial intelligence, we actually can work to bypass this method DFT entirely, because we go from an input that is just atomic positions to an output, which is electronic density, which is simply a 3D image. All right, thank you. I'm sorry for going a bit over the time.
Thank you, Jorge. Our next speaker is Maria Calahorra-Jimenez from Fresno State, Construction and Engineering Management. Maria.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so my research is a little bit different from the previous presenters. It's more applied. So I am a civil engineer and I'm working in the Department of Construction Management. So my main focus has been always the infrastructures, okay? And before I work in the industry, working with infrastructures, and now in the academia, I want to do research to improve how we manage infrastructures. Okay, so I have kind of three lines of research. One is more focused on data, the other is more focused on environment, and the other in gender, but all of them around the transportation projects or infrastructure projects. So I have here, this is the outline, a little bit of terminology, so you are clear about what I am talking about. And then what is the approach that I have to these three topics. That I could say that I have kind of one approach for these two, data and environment, and the gender is kind of a different line. Okay, so for those of you who don't know anything about how transportation projects are designed and built, usually there is a project life cycle. So we have the project conception, then project delivery, design, procurement, construction, and then operation, okay? Usually if you don't know about this field, you just see the roads or the bridges, and that's all, but there is a process behind. Within this process, we have what we call project delivery systems and procurement, okay? The project delivery system establishes the sequence of design and construction that may be different. So how the different key players in the design and construction are engaged in the project may be different depending on the project delivery system. And then also the relationships between the designers, constructors, and consultants may be different depending on the project delivery system. So we may have different types, okay? Here I just put design bid build, meaning it's a sequence, first the design, then the procurement of the construction, and then the construction is done. But another project delivery system is design build, where the design builders are hired together and work together from the beginning, or almost from the beginning, not exactly, but almost. There are much more project delivery methods, but it's not the objective of this presentation. Then the procurement is how these designer, constructors, and other consultants are selected. Because my focus is infrastructure, I am always talking about public owners, public clients. So those are the ones that are going to select us for doing the job, select the company firms, the construction firms, design firms, etc. For example, here in California, maybe Caltrans, okay, or City of Fresno. So there may be different ways of selecting the teams, maybe only based on cost, like low bid, or maybe considering cost, but other factors like other technical aspects, and this is called best value. So you can see that we have different methods for delivering the project, and each may have different outcomes. So my research approach for this data and environment part is, okay, I want, or I am examining this project delivery methods and procurement methods that are in pre-construction, so before just start building anything. And I want to see how I can improve these methods, these processes, to achieve, to improve the goals that we have at the end of the project. So when we build the project, we are okay with the cost, we are okay with time, or we have cost overruns, we have delays. What can we do in this pre-construction part so we can be more efficient with these final outcomes or metrics that we had when we finished the construction of the project? I told you that I am kind of condensing here the data and the environment, because one thing that I want to, and I think I have in the next slide. So you can see here, this is my overarching questions, how exploring here or doing research here, we can improve the final outcomes after construction of the project. So this is again kind of similar thing, maybe cost time, and maybe resilience and sustainability, how we can have better, more resilient, more sustainable projects. So I want to make that link. What I've done so far and I am going to share this web page that we have here. I have here my my research lines. Okay, if we go to project delivery and procurement methods, those are research that I have already done, that it is like taking this concept that I am explaining to you and focus on one specific point. For example, in this one, this is a book chapter, okay? So what we did here is to look to the design build project delivery system and the procurement method that was used in this delivery system. And we analyzed how the scores that are given when the owner is selecting the teams, how kind of the distribution of those scores, if you score in a very narrow range of if it is broader, how this impacts the probability of selecting the team that is the lowest bidder, for example. Or in this second, this is an article that a research that I did with one student here at Fresno State, and we presented at this conference. But again, same thing, same concept. We take the design build, best value, and what we reviewed here is how this delivery system and procurement consider long-term performance in projects, if they are evaluation criteria that are used for considering this specific aspect, and so on and so forth. So what I have some grants also associated with this, but it's kind of zooming into these methods and see if we tweak something, what may be the result in the selection, for example, if we are talking about the procurement. So this is what I have done so far, kind of very quick. And now the idea that I have in mind and that I would like to kind of do in the future is to make this link between this information that we have in pre-construction about the type of project delivery system, different kind of more detailed information about the project delivery system and about the procurement, information about the projects themselves, all this information that we already have historically, because we can have this data from DOTs. And then we also have, may have the result of the selection of the result of the project in terms of cost, quality, etc. So I would like to use a more kind of artificial intelligence or a more advanced statistical analysis to find trends that can guide DOTs in the future in the selection of these delivery system and procurement methods. So if we can learn from what we have done across the United States, perhaps we can have better guidance when selecting these different methods that are available. And this is something that is not there yet. So each DOT in each state is doing the things as they think is best, but there's not a specific guidance. So I think there is a gap there that may be good to address. And in the same thing, not looking at these trends between the project delivery and the results of the project. And another thing that I am interested is in seeing how improving this delivery system and procurement can have an impact in sustainability and resilience in transportation projects. So for this, I have done some research on sustainability. It was more in kind of analysis of project life cycle and emissions and things like that. But now I would like to find people who is an expert in environment and resilience. And I would like to see how I can create this research in the pre-construction side of things to kind of have a positive impact in resilience and sustainability in infrastructure projects. So this is kind of these two that are more kind of tied together a little bit, these two themes. The last one is another one that it's currently in progress. Okay, so I am from Spain. I am female. I've been working in the civil engineering and construction industry for more than 14 years, and we are a minority. There is a lot of things to do to increase the participation of women in construction and in engineering. So I am thinking of preparing an NSF proposal, focus on broadening the participation of females in these fields. And this is going to be next year, by the end of next year. I want to explore these questions and others that I have, but for this presentation, I put this one: how the participation of women in civil engineering and heavy civil construction can be broadened in different stages of the career life cycle. And what is the role of intersectionality? Because I am interested in knowing, okay, we're women, but also maybe a minority, Hispanic or others, and then maybe first generation. So how all these factors can impact and how we can do something to help this group of people. So for this one, well, I am already working with some undergraduate students. We are replicating some studies that has been done in other countries. You can see there the research questions that we are aiming to answer. And we are focusing on different kind of stages within the career life cycle. So yes, people who finish the university, people who is working and has been working for more than 5 years. And we're going to gather information using questionnaires and interviews. This is something that is currently being done by students. But for this proposal that I am planning to do in next semester, I would like to meet and to learn from people who is an expert in, for example, women and gender studies, race, ethnic studies, because I am civil engineer. I am interested in doing this, but I am not an expert in that area. So it would be very interesting to me. So and with that, this is all what I have for today. Thank you very much. Happy to answer any question.
Okay, thank you, Maria, and thank you to all the presenters. And I'd like to open up the floor to questions from anyone and everyone who has questions. So questions, comments from anyone? Yes, Matt.
This is a slightly silly question for, science-wise for Jorge, but he can probably answer it quickly. So you mentioned, at least in your framing of the applications to conditions in Earth's core, although your work is much more general than that. So I think for 40 years, there's been this idea in the popular imagination that the core of Jupiter and other giant planets might be a diamond or something. I think might be Arthur C. Clarke responsible for some of that. Your thoughts?
Well, the thing is, it all depends on the abundance. I have seen calculations that they do not say that for Jupiter, but they say it's possible, depending on the paper. I've seen people that say that it's possible for Saturn. I've seen people that say it's possible for Uranus.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So I've seen that stuff. This is all, of course, theoretical papers. But yeah, I've seen calculations that say, depending on how the materials arrange during the formation of the planet, if you can get if not the core, at least like a layer around the core, like if it gets enough concentration of carbon, yeah, it would form diamond. Of course, it could be just papers that are a bit attention grabbing.
Great. Well, thanks for that perspective. It's much more nuanced than what I knew about it.
No problem.
So Jenny, I have a question about the hummingbirds. You said that these hummingbirds, they're actually happy in high density places. Is it because the hummingbirds have evolved, kind of like people have evolved to like McDonald's food, Is it the same way that hummingbirds have evolved to actually reside in, because, hummingbirds did not start out living in areas of high density population. So what came first? Is it that they have grown to like these areas because of whatever reasons, or what?
Yeah, so this is sort of gets to sort of a fundamental question in urban ecology, which is why do some species succeed in urban environments while others do not? And a lot of it has to do with some inherent traits of those species. So there are some species that are what we call specialists or ecological specialists, where they are highly specific and specialized in the needs that they have. You might describe them as like very picky eaters. They need a certain plant, or they need a certain range of temperatures, et cetera, to live in. And then there are other species that, are what we call generalists, and they can sort of have more plasticity in terms of what they can feed on and, where they can survive and live. And so it's probably related to the reason that this species is doing well is probably related to them being a more generalized species with more plasticity, just inherently, in terms of, what they can eat, especially, and what sort of temperatures they can survive in, and the level of disturbance that they're comfortable with from noise and light and things like that. Whereas other species are probably more specialists, right? But that's something that we're going to find out with the study. And in terms of their evolution, that's a really good question. There is a lot of evidence in urban environments of what we call rapid evolution in response to urbanization. We've seen in some species, different birds are actually like changing the frequency of their communications, of their calls and songs to be heard better above traffic noise and things like that. So evolution is certainly possible, even over relatively short periods of time. It's always happening. But in terms of, have Anna's hummingbirds specifically evolved in response to the urban environment? That is a great question that we should research. But certainly we can say they're probably more generalist, and that's likely why they're succeeding in these urban environments.
Maybe it's something as basic as, some of these animals are high maintenance versus low maintenance. The high maintenance ones are going to survive very well because they're something as picky eaters or picky living conditions or what have you, whereas those low maintenance ones are more rugged and are more able to morph and to modify their behavior based on the surroundings, may it be weather or those that want to,
eat
them up or
yeah.
What have you. So just like people.
Yeah. And
if
so
you know what I mean.
the question is like, how can we then use that information to make cities a better place for more species, right? Like what helps these generalist species survive, and what could we change to make it so that more specialist species could also succeed?
And I'm familiar with Eric Woods. When I was at Cal State LA, he did a lot of GIS stuff. So I was very intrigued by how he looked at birds, and where he looked at the urban dwellings and what birds actually survived and what some didn't. So I was very, very intrigued by that. So thank you for your presentation. Any other questions? Yes, Matt.
Oh, just to jump back on the hummingbird thing, Jenny, should I be feeding them anything other than the standard sugar water that I put in my feeder, or is this still okay? They do have other flowers and things that they slurp on in my yard.
Yeah, I get this question a lot. I am prepared for it. So I would say the main thing is, your sugar water is fine. Just don't add red dye. Some people think they need to add the red dye. But you don't need to do that. And there's not a lot of research on hummingbird health, but there's some evidence that, that dye might not be the best thing for them to be eating. So just, and honestly, I just use tap water and, regular sugar, and it's fine. But the main thing is to make sure that you're planting lots of great California native plant species in your yard as well for them to feed on. And there's some evidence that under some conditions, putting a feeder up might take away from their visiting those flowers. And the flowers do have additional nutrients in them that your sugar water won't. So, you know, native plants are always the preference, but feeders bring us a lot of joy because it kind of concentrates hummingbirds. And so I think there's like definitely a social benefit to that in terms of people bonding to nature. So I never say like, get rid of your feeders unless, you know, occasionally, like recently there was sort of some avian pathogens that were circulating in the wild bird community, especially in migratory birds in North America. And so we were being told to take feeders down because that could be a site for disease transmission. So, you know, at times like that, just pay attention to the news. Then it is maybe a good idea to take your feeder down. But otherwise, I think they bring people a lot of joy. And so as long as you've got some native plants there as well for them to feed on, you know, you're doing great. Enjoy them. And thank you for offering to send me a fecal sample from your porch.
Just let me know.
And I want to come back to the hummingbird, but Maria, we can help. We can circle back in terms of you know, broadening participation. We've written a number of proposals in a variety of different, you know, broadening participation of, you know, computer science, you know, chemistry, what have you. So we can close that loop at a future date. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. This is the topic that I wanted to discuss with you.
Yeah. We'll close that loop. You know, real quick, Jenny. You know, my parents, you know, fortunately they're still around, but they have a few feeders in their backyard. And my dad goes out there and you know, puts whatever he wants out there, and he I don't say he likes, but he sees oftentimes, you know, the little birds, you know, they're there eating, and then this giant bird comes and just like scares all of the those little birds away, and he or she bird just dominates eating all the food. I guess you really can't do anything because, you know, Darwin, you know, survival of the fittest, right?
Yeah, so this is this is part of why people connect with them so much. It's part of why I'm probably getting so many questions about them. They're very charismatic little creatures. They really capture our imaginations. And yeah, part of the reason for that is that they're extremely feisty. You know, they're not these like picturesque, like beautiful little fluffy things. Like they fight each other a lot. They're extremely territorial. As a lot of the species we have in North America are highly territorial. However, the epicenter of hummingbird biodiversity is actually in the Andes mountains of South America. That's where I did my PhD work. And there you have some species that are less territorial, but pretty much all the species we have here in North America are extremely territorial, and they will defend a patch of resources. It actually makes it really hard to catch them sometimes because I'll set up my trap and then like a bird will decide to dominate that trap and they'll chase all the other birds away, but then they also won't eat. So I'm just like stuck there with my trap trying to catch this bird, and it won't go in. There's one bird on our campus that I call Nemesis bird. Like me and my students, every time we go past it, we go, because we just been trying to catch it for like 3 years and we can't.
Well, thank you everybody for your participation. We're almost at the top of the hour, and for those who attended, you know, we appreciate that also. Just FYI, we have a webcast on October 4th, CSU exemplars in engineering. That will be at 11 o'clock, and our next cafe is October 18th. We will be sending out information on registration shortly. So thank you for attending and for participating in STEMnet's activities. Take care and have a great rest of your week.